All right. So now that we've described and explored what the phase shift does to a graph, we're going to talk about if I give you an equation, how can you identify the amplitude, the period, the phase shift, and the vertical shift for that graph? Because remember, it's all about the transformations. At its core, f of t will look like a sine graph, but it has lots of things going on. So let's jump into it. All right. So ideally, what I want to do is I want to take this equation and rewrite it into this form. A sine of b of t minus c plus d. And some people, you could also write it this way by putting an extra set of parentheses around it. That's the way Desmos had me do it. I'll let you know in your assignment what kind of formatting I'm looking for, just to be clear, okay? All right. So based off this, I can kind of see how things line up. No brainer, that's A, that's D, but it's this part that's inside the sine function that actually I have to do a little bit of work. So I need to make the yellows match. So what I'm going to do is think about it as it's not the right thing. I'm going to think about f of t as 3 sine of 5 t minus 2 plus 2/5. Or if I want to, I can think about it as, since it's a plus, I know that's just a double negative, so I'm subtracting a negative 2/5 plus 9. And I only did that just so I can very easily identify all the components properly. So here's what I got. The amplitude will be 3. So that means that instead of the graph oscillating 1 unit up, 1 unit down from that midline, it's going to go 3 up, 3 down. But you guys kind of know that at this point, or should know it at this point. The period, oh boy, here comes the talk. So the period is just asking me, well, how long will it take for this graph to complete one cycle? Now, typically, a period for a sine graph should be 2 pi, right? However, we have this 5 here that's messing things up. The 5 is horizontally compressing the graph by a factor of 5. So instead of the period taking 2 pi to complete, it's going to take 1/5 of that amount of time to complete. So the period should actually be 2 pi divided by 5. As long as you understand where the 2 pi comes from and why it's always going to be 2 pi, think about what I did with that b value to get my period. All right. And then we got the phase shift. So the phase shift is telling me how is the graph moving. So phase shift, got to make sure I put that F there, otherwise it's not a good word. All right, so since I was able to rewrite in this form, I noticed this is my phase shift. It's a negative 2/5. So that means it's moving left two-fifths. And last but not least, we got the vertical shift. Thought about spelling shift before I finished spelling vertical. That's why you see the vertical shift. But really the vertical shift is just changing where the midline is, right? So I would say it's up 9. And that's all I would do for that. Okay? So let's try it again, but now let's look at a cosine graph and let's look at some weird stuff. Because numbers have been kind of nice lately, so YOLO. Now we have g of t. G of t, I can rewrite that. If I think about this as g of t is equal to 8 cosine of pi multiplying an x over a minus a 3 over pi minus a 6. So just how I did over here, this number that's multiplying the x has to be the b value, as in Bob. So since I need to pull that out, I just divide whatever I'm about to highlight by that b value that I've identified, and I deal with whatever I have to deal with. All right? It's not pretty. I don't like 3 divided by pi, but it's what I got. So the amplitude, I always forget. The amplitude is 8 because that's that number right there. The period is typically 2 pi, but my b value is, b as in Bob I should say, is pi. So it turns out my period is just 2. That's a little freaky. But okay. The phase shift. See, in my head I thought, man, that looks really nice. Played myself. I'm subtracting this quantity. So that means I'm moving right 3 over pi units. Okay. And then to get the vertical shift, aka the midline, well, that's just down 6 units. Okay, so that's what I'm expecting for this. And since, all right, let me know if you guys have questions on this. Again, I'll be available for office hours tomorrow. Period.